With the launch of the iPhone 15 and 15 Pro, we've seen the typical restructuring of Apple's lineup that they do every year, knocking down the price of older devices and discontinuing their lowest tiers, with the exception of the terrible value iPhone SE that I already spoke about in a recent video. Last year, the iPhone 12 mini was discontinued, with the 12 still being sold alongside the iPhone 13 and 13 mini. This year, the 12 is now gone, and along with it, the 13 mini, making the larger iPhone 13 the new $600 option. With this, we've seen the end of Apple's little experiment with the mini iPhone, something I was a huge fan of personally. The small phone market is one woefully ignored these days, and while the SE is still around and fairly small, it just isn't the same as a premium, high-quality iPhone with all the bells and whistles of its bigger brothers, but in a slick, small, compact package. Hey, how's it going? I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and today I wanted to just take a few minutes to talk about the death of the mini iPhone, both the background of how we got here and what the future might hold.
We also wanted to do something a little different, something only Apple would do. This is iPhone 12 mini.
I completely forgot how great that iPhone 12 mini introduction was, so I just had to let it play out, but you know, she was right. This was something only Apple would do. A completely uncompromising mini flagship phone, at a time where phones only continued to get larger and more cumbersome year over year. In late 2020, it was the iPhone 12 and 12 Pro Max headlining as Apple's next flagship phones, and with them came the non-Pro variants. Phones that looked and performed very similarly, but missed out on some of the luxury features, mainly involving the camera setup. The 12 Pro had 3 lenses on the rear with LiDAR, whereas the lower tier only had the ultra-wide and regular wide lens. But aside from that, the iPhone 12 and 12 mini were shockingly close to what the 12 Pro was. I remember being mildly surprised, but very happy when Apple came out with the iPhone 12 mini. It was finally a premium, smaller smartphone, a niche that had been completely unfulfilled by both Apple and Android competitors going back until probably 2016 with the iPhone SE. I'd say that was the last good small phone. That device could be considered sort of a precursor to the iPhone 12 mini in a certain sense, as they would share a lot in common. The same basic specs and cameras of the top tier iPhones available, a design aimed towards those who prefer smaller phones and didn't have a lot of options anymore, and a price tag that provided savings to anyone who either preferred the smaller device anyways, or just didn't care about the more expensive, bigger one. Not that the 12 mini was particularly cheap, coming in at $700 versus $800 for the 12 when it first came out, but I think that was really okay because ultimately the iPhone 12 mini really was still very much a top-tier smartphone, and the build quality reflected that, as well as the feature set. The iPhone SE in 2016 was cheap because it used the same old design as the iPhone 5S, allowing Apple to save money and then pass some of those savings on to the consumer. It wasn't a perfect phone, but it was one of the best deals I think Apple has ever had, having the same chip and main camera as the iPhone 6S, the newest iPhone at the time, with drawbacks that were understandable and totally reasonable, things that didn't significantly hinder the experience. Slower Touch ID, an older selfie camera, no 3D touch, and so on. Battery life was never that good, but in fairness, the SE was a very small phone, and so that was to be expected. It got the job done, right? The iPhone 12 mini was in a different boat here because it has absolutely no downsides from the 6.1-inch iPhone 12, being 5.4 inches at a size very similar to that old iPhone SE or 5S, but now the screen was edge-to-edge and OLED, making for a sharper, more vibrant display with true blacks that would blow away even the iPhone 11 from just a year prior. This was a flagship phone that just so happened to be smaller. It wasn't a small phone with a few features packed in there and marked up at an exorbitant price. And the battery life was surprisingly not bad, as long as you have reasonable expectations. And if you were to turn off 5G functionality, you can actually save a good amount of battery life, so that does help. The 12 mini's only drawback to the bigger 12 was the size and the smaller battery as a result, but that's sort of just it. It was $100 cheaper, and while I always still recommended the larger 12 for most people, because most people don't want a small phone, for those who did want a smaller phone or just didn't really care, it was kind of an absolute no-brainer, and a very much pro-consumer move from Apple, a company that isn't always known for such pro-consumer moves. They never had to make a mini iPhone, and they no doubt knew it wasn't going to sell nearly as well as their bigger counterparts, but they made it anyways, and I respect that. I think it's commendable. And then in the next year in 2021, we would see the iPhone 13 and 13 mini come out alongside the iPhone 13 Pro and 13 Pro Max. Like the year prior, the 13 wasn't missing too much from the 13 Pro. The biggest feature lacking was probably the ProMotion or 120Hz refresh rate, which makes more frames per second, and so the whole experience feels significantly smoother. It's a really nice thing to have, but it's also not inherently necessary to the experience. Most people don't know what a refresh rate is, and it's not going to bother them. It does feel much nicer and a lot smoother. You'll be glad to have it once you do, but nobody really needs it unless you're really into mobile gaming, I guess. So the iPhone 13 and 13 mini not having this feature was not a surprise, and it wasn't really a downside, because again, most people weren't going to care. The 13 mini actually saw some pretty major upgrades over the iPhone 12 mini, with the biggest one being battery life. The 13 mini's battery is, dare I say it, actually not that bad or even kind of good, at least compared to the middling but sort of okay iPhone 12 mini battery life. The cameras saw improvement, as they usually do year over year. The chipset was upgraded to the next generation, and then the notch got smaller on the 13 mini as well, which at the time I never really considered that much of an upgrade, but for the mini phones it actually stands out a lot more because the notch is naturally going to take up more of your screen, just taking up a larger percentage on that small display, versus on a bigger iPhone where the notch just isn't as bad because, I mean, the screen is so big anyways. The smaller notch definitely had the 13 mini feeling more modern, and it really made for the ultimate small smartphone, probably the best one ever made even to this day. Yeah, to this day, because unfortunately in 2022, well, unfortunately for those who like small phones anyway, Apple decided to go the exact opposite direction and come out with the iPhone 14 and 14 Plus. And I don't think that was necessarily a bad thing for Apple to do, make a plus size iPhone. It means for those who want the larger display, they don't have to shell out for the Pro Max, which, you know, is quite expensive and always over $1,000. So if you didn't really care about the Pro features but just wanted a bigger screen, 14 Plus is there to get you, or the 15 Plus this year. Even so, it showed that Apple was moving away from the mini, a worrying trend that would only continue. At this point, Apple would also restructure their iPhone lineup so the 12 mini was no longer available, because if it had been, it would have cost $500, only $70 more than their iPhone SE from the same year 2022, which was for the most part a vastly inferior product. I do say mostly because the SE does have some upsides compared to the iPhone 12 and 12 mini, well, one upside, and that's the A15 chipset. It's got a slightly faster chip in there. Other than that, it's all downsides really, and the battery life is about equal from the 12 mini to the iPhone SE. The SE will probably get an extra year of software support over the 12 and 12 mini, so there's that, but real life performance, there's not really much difference. So other than the chipset, the 12 mini is certainly superior to the iPhone SE, with a high quality OLED panel that goes edge to edge as well. It's got the more modern build and a plethora of premium features and Face ID, 2 camera lenses, both of which are significantly better than what the SE has. MagSafe, the SE doesn't have MagSafe for some reason. Don't get me wrong, I think the SE is a good phone. It's just super overpriced, especially now, which I've done a video on, so I'm not going to get into that too much. In 2023, out comes the iPhone 15 and 15 Plus, alongside the high-end iPhone 15 Pro and 15 Pro Max. And this brings us to today with the iPhone lineup looking as follows. Notably, the iPhone 13 is still around, costing $600, but the 13 mini is now gone altogether. So what does this mean? The 13 mini is no longer being sold by Apple, and both retailers and carriers are always quick to follow suit. They'll clear out the last of their inventory, possibly putting those phones on sale, which is potentially notable for the keen buyer out there. But then that's it. You know, they're never going to hit store shelves again. Apple themselves obviously aren't selling it anymore, but you might find inventory occasionally on their refurbished section. I mentioned that just in case you're interested. Right now, when I checked, it wasn't there. It's just mainly iPhone 12s and 12 Pros, but that could vary, so you know, that's something to keep an eye on. It also differs by location. This, by the way, not the worst deal for an iPhone 12, especially when you consider that the SE is $20 less. Oh boy, that's bad. So with all this in mind, if you want to purchase a mini iPhone, you're looking at the used market, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. This video is not so much about whether or not the phones are worth it. I'll leave that to my normal iPhone buying guides, but yes, eBay.com is always an option, or your local Facebook Marketplace, Craigslist, whatever you got. You're going to want to be careful of the typical pitfalls like an unhealthy battery or a phone being iCloud locked, something to watch out for. But I do personally believe that buying used is a really good way to go right now. It's kind of a win-win. You get a mini iPhone if that's your personal preference, even though Apple doesn't have any options for you anymore. And then even better, you don't give Apple your money. Instead, you give the money to potentially somebody who's going to buy a new smartphone themselves. It's the circle of life or something like that. Well, okay, Apple does have one option for you, but it's the severely compromised iPhone SE. It's hard for me to call the SE a true option for those who prefer compact devices. It's great for those who prefer the older home button experience, right? Maybe they don't need too much out of their device, but the iPhone 12 mini and 13 mini really really stand out because they were completely uncompromising. And that's really the word I want to push there. Compromise. These phones were without compromise. The 12 mini was the exact same phone as the iPhone 12, just smaller. The 13 mini was the exact same phone as the 13, just smaller. That was it. That was the only difference, just the size, and that's absolutely wild that Apple was doing that. To have such a fully fledged flagship device in such a small compact package is really impressive. Don't forget as well, it's only the last 2 years the Pro iPhones have really started to separate themselves from the non-Pros. Apple is purposely making more of a gap because for a while there the Pros weren't that much better than their non-Pro counterparts, right? Like the iPhone 12 and 12 Pro are literally like the exact same dimensions. Like you can swap the cases back and forth on them, I'm pretty sure. The phones were almost identical. You know, there's the camera and LiDAR, but aside from that, and since the 12 mini is just a smaller 12, you're getting a phone that is really, really close to the 12 Pro, but in a very small package. And that goes for the 13 mini as well. The 13 mini, the 12 mini, $300 cheaper than the base Pro phones at launch. And yet, they were very uncompromising. They were just smaller and had one less camera lens. Talk about a win-win for those who prefer the smaller size. You get to save money and you get a top-end flagship. One that could absolutely hold its own against the toughest smartphone competition available. That uncompromising premium iPhone experience is completely unparalleled on the Android side, at least as far as I'm aware. I think it's a real pity that Apple isn't making those mini phones anymore. But still, if Apple had to cut off the mini line, I think the 13 mini was a good note to end on. The 14 and 14 Plus are barely better than the iPhone 13, and thus the 13 mini, with the main difference being they have the 13 Pro chipset instead of, you know, the 13 chipset. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure why Apple felt like they needed a bigger jump between their non-Pro and Pro iPhones, but I guess they did. And so it was the iPhone 14 that ended up as the victim in all this because it was barely an upgrade. Why did Apple drop the mini iPhones? Well, best guess the minis weren't selling very well. Part of the reason is that it's a very niche market for small phones, and they get mixed in with people who only buy them because they're cheaper. So maybe normally they would have bought the next size up, but because the mini was an option, they saved some money and bought that instead. Apple doesn't want that. They want you to buy their higher priced phones, ideally. It makes them more money. At this point, I highly doubt that they saved much making the mini phones. Apple has to price those minis less than the normal size, despite them basically having identical hardware. Making the body and the screen smaller isn't going to save them as much money as you might expect. Plus, people who want those small phones were a bit starved for options until the iPhone 12 mini, which means I think most people who really want small phones probably jumped on board fairly quickly when the 12 mini and 13 mini came out. Thus, you end up with a peak in sales and then a big drop off in the years following. Honestly, I could be way off base, and there could be way more factors than this. In fact, there definitely are more factors than this. But ultimately, there's just a much higher demand for larger smartphones, and that's what it comes down to. Apple is dropping the minis and coming out with the plus sizes instead because they think it's going to make them more money. So where do we go from here? One theory I've seen bouncing around is that the next iPhone SE, the 4th generation, is going to replace the 13 mini in the lineup, so it'll look probably the same. I think this is probably pretty unlikely. All rumors for the next SE have been pointing to a 6.1-inch display, which is their same standard size that they use in their base phones. These are all just rumors, and you know, the next SE may not happen at all, or it could be a year away, 2 years away, who knows? It's really impossible to say until it actually comes out. But I definitely wouldn't get my hopes up for a mini phone coming anytime soon. If a new SE does come out at 6.1 inches, I would be a bit confused, as it would likely replace the current SE, and then Apple would have absolutely no offerings for smaller phones. They've always had some smaller option in their lineup, even if it's a few years older, but also the SE4 would have some stiff competition with the iPhone 13, because wouldn't it be very similar? I don't understand where Apple's lineup is going, if I'm being honest. I think there's got to be more to the story, and maybe Apple does have some smaller options in the works, who knows? The mini iPhone might be dead for now, but the millions of users sure aren't going away anytime soon, and it's impossible to say whether or not Apple will ever make a product once again to capture that niche market. Because it is a very niche crowd. If you prefer smaller phones, that's awesome, but you are in the minority. But even so, I really hope Apple does make another mini phone down the line, because while it is a minority that likes smaller phones, I still think there's a lot more people out there than maybe anyone would expect. People who prefer that smaller, compact size, uncompromising experience at a smaller size, especially in this world of phones getting bigger and more cumbersome year over year. There's really something to be said about having a definitive flagship experience in a small compact package. The Android side, aside from all the budget options, they left behind small devices long ago. And hopefully this won't be the case, and it's too early to say for sure, but there is a possibility the iPhone 13 mini may be the greatest small phone ever made forever. I guess we'll have to wait and see. And with that, I think I'm right about done here. I know this video wasn't anything long or crazy or that in depth, but I just wanted to point out that Apple's no longer making those mini phones. And yeah, I think that kind of sucks, honestly. Those mini phones were great for people who wanted them. Are you a fan of the small form factor? Anyone using the 12 mini or 13 mini? It always surprises me how many people have those phones. So make sure you comment below. If you found this video interesting, maybe hit that like button and consider subscribing for more content just like this. You can follow me on my social medias if you want to. We've got a Discord server, come by, say hi, and a huge shout out to the channel members. As always, you guys are the best. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and I will see you all next time.